Hello, I'm Gabriella, I'm nursing, I'm specialized in addictions and currently I'm a PhD student at University of São Paulo, Brazil and University of Lisbon, Portugal. I represent a part of the first results of my thesis, which is about substance addiction consequences, a comparative study of Brazil and Portugal. This proposal started from similar research conducted in the two countries for me and my advisors. We used the same scale to measure the consequences of addiction. Then we gathered the data and produced this study. I will be able to answer any questions if you have. And I will be at the weekly roundup panel discussion. Here is my email too, if someone wants to write to me. So the learning objectives are, first of all, to understand the difference and similarities of the substance addiction consequences in Brazil and Portugal. Second of all, to compare the profiles of people in specialized public treatment units in Brazil and Portugal. Now I will hide my video so as not to disturb the presentation. Okay. We know that acting on the consequences of substance addiction has been one of the global goals of public mental health and sustainable development. The impact of this damage takes on similar characteristics in several countries and results in increased rates of morbidity and mortality, reduced quality of life, and it's related with a lot of social problems. Brazil and Portugal may be similar regarding language and culture, but differ in development, extension, demographics, health policies, disease burden, and substance use too. Both countries have public, universal, comprehensive, and decentralized health systems, but operate with opposing public policies on the criminalization in Brazil and decriminalization in Portugal. For example, harm reduction policies are stronger in Portugal and in Brazil still are inconsistent. About the substance use in these two contexts, the mean age of first substance consumption is 16 years old in Brazil and 18 years old in Portugal. The addictions rates of the general population are 1.5% in Brazil and 1.3% in Portugal. In both countries, alcohol is the most consumed, but as for the problems related to consumption, they appear more from the crack and heroin. Talking about the approach and healthcare, there is an important difference between these countries. The psychosocial care centers in Brazil and the specialized treatment teams with substitution therapies in Portugal are the protagonist serves to take care of substance users. And in Brazil, we don't have this answer to addiction. So apparently in Brazil, the problem with substance addiction is worse than Portugal, but we don't know exactly what aspects are involved in these rates. Because of this study aims to compare the substance addiction consequences by people in Brazil and Portugal. How the concept of substance addiction consequences we use it by nursing outcomes classification, impairment of health status and social function resulting from the use of alcohol and other drugs. The methods. So data collection carried out in 2019 with 360 users in treatment and public services 200 in Brazil, more specifically in São Paulo, 162 in Portugal, more specifically in Lisbon. With an application of the sociodemographic instrument and the substance addiction consequences scale. The sociodemographic instrument is not the same for the two research, but this scale is the same. And this scale was validated in Portugal in 2018, and in Brazil this year it is in press. The reference value for assessing the severity of the subjects using the scale is 48 points, which represents 15% of the possibilities for results. The higher the scale value, the smaller the consequences related to the consumption of alcohol and other drugs. So less than 48, the severity is high, and more or equal than 48, the severity is not accentuated. The statistical program STATA analyzed the data with descriptive statistics and logistic regression. The control variables have social benefits, age, number of children, household with whom they live, the users, marital status, gender, and employment status. We used 95% confidence intervals and considered p-value smaller than or equal to 0.05 for statistical significance. And both studies, Brazil and Portugal, obtained ethical approval. So the first results, it's about sociodemographic, health, and substance consumption profile of users in the two countries. In Brazil, the support network household for substance users is minimal. They live on average with one person and don't have a child. In Portugal, this average is 2 people and 1 child, so a little better than Brazil. Regarding age, in Brazil, users are younger than Portugal, on average 43 years old, and in Portugal, this average rises to 46 years old, so 3 years of difference. Here is the complete profile of users, here, in the two countries, about sociodemographic, health, and substance use. We can observe that gender, civil status, and work situation are the same, that the profile of people who have problems with the use of alcohol and drugs and need treatment around the world. So they are men, single, and unemployed. However, comparing Brazil and Portugal, the Portuguese are more stable in their relationships, and there is an important difference in work and the type of work, because in Brazilians, only 6 people have formal work, which is the important thing to consider here. And the stable union is more observed in the Portuguese users. Consequently, there is a difference in social support by Brazilian people. They need more social support than the Portuguese because they are more vulnerable. So the users of Brazil receive public support. 100 to 23 users receive public support, and only 44 in Portugal. In both countries, the use of medications is similar, but this data suggested that in Portugal, this use is related to the substitution therapies, and in Brazil, with medicalization to control signs and symptoms related to use as part of the treatment received by users. So even with the similarity, we have the important difference about the medications used in two countries. About the physical and mental comorbidities, the depression is similar in the two countries and also with global rates that we observe. And are a high difference in rates of hepatitis that in Portugal is higher than Brazil, with almost 15% of the sample diagnosed with this condition. Also, there are differences between personality disorders and psychosis. Diagnostics of personality disorder is much common in Portugal, and psychosis is much common in Brazil. About substance use in these two countries, alcohol is prevalent in the two countries, and in Brazil, the cocaine use, usually crack, and in Portugal, opiates, usually heroin, is the most common illicit substance in use. Among the profile results that could not be compared due to the different contexts of the research is homeless and road of consumption, because 77% of users in Brazil are homeless, but in Portugal it's not a big problem. So this variable didn't appear in the research, in Portuguese research. Nevertheless, Portugal has intravenous use, and there isn't a reality in Brazil. So we have two variables that we can't compare, but it is important to discuss the results. Then, in summary, the main differences between the individuals and the relationship of social condition, support network, work situation, income, and housing, the choice, substance, crack in Brazil and heroin in Portugal, and psychotic comorbidities. About the substance addiction consequence, this graph shows the total score of the substance addiction consequence scale. Portugal has fewer consequences related to consumption when compared to Brazil, from 43% to 65% of the population. We can see here in this graph, remember the reference value is 48. So we have more consequences related to addiction in Brazil because most people are below that 48. Different than Portugal, where most people are above 48 score. Here is the results about the dimensions of scale. And in all dimensions, the severity value of these consequences is always greater in the Brazilian sample. We can observe this in mean. The most severity dimensions are the dimension 4 for Brazil. It's about difficulties in maintaining employment and income and absenteeism from work or school, for example. And in Portugal, the severity dimension is the dimension 1, that is sadness, isolation, loneliness, anxiety, and problems in family relationship. Here in this table, we present the models of logistic regressions and about sociodemographic, health, substance use, and the result of scale with countries as independent variables. So Brazil and Portugal are the independent variables. In yellow are the Portugal consequences with statistical significance, and red is the Brazil consequence with statistical significance. Starting with the substance addiction consequence, the Portugal population has 1.9 times fewer chance to have severe consequences than the population of Brazil. So it is significant statistical. Looking at the other significant variables, there is an expressive difference between hepatitis and drug therapies by the population of Portugal that is 6.3 times more likely to have hepatitis and 5.3 times more likely to participate in drug therapies. For this case, it is known that these results are related to public policy in this country because the Portuguese are much more screened than the Brazilian for transmission disease, also in the context of drug use. So it's evident in this result, and it doesn't mean more problems in Portugal, but key knowledge about the population. So in Portugal is more knowledge. And about the drug therapies, this result can be justified by the substitution therapies with methadone for heroin and disulfiram for alcohol, for instance. What doesn't happen in Brazil? So this result doesn't mean that the people with a problem with substance use take many types of medications to abstinence or to control the consumption. However, benzodiazepines use is different because the result show that the Portuguese have 8 times more chance to use benzodiazepines than the Brazilian, and we cannot say whether this use is prescribed or harmful use. So it's a different scenario of this consumption. About the other significant variables, the population of Portugal has 11 times more chances of personality disorders and 3 times more chance to use tobacco. The Brazil population has 0.2 more times of psychosis and 0.1 time more to use cocaine. Some significance, it's about 0.05 and other about 0.001. In summary, the evidence shows that the population of Brazil has more chance to use cocaine, psychosis, and to have more consequences related to substance addiction. However, in Portugal, the users have more chance to use benzodiazepines, tobacco, medication therapies, hepatitis, and personality disorders. To interpret this data, we need to consider some aspects as the socio-demographic variables, how an important aspect to the Brazilian population, public policies that criminalize the user in Brazil, what is different in Portugal, and fragilities in the harm reduction strategies, substitution therapies, and other options to care of the substance addiction consequence, what and often prevent access to different treatments by users in Brazil. So we can take this need to consider these aspects. How conclusions? In general, the consequences related to substance use are more serious in Brazil, the country with high social vulnerability and among this population. Portugal, on the other hand, due to the policy of decriminalizing consumption and harm reduction strategies, presents better results in view of the consequences. Here's some reference that we use in this presentation, and thank you so much for attention.